I'd like for you to talk about the three most pressing issues in your mind that we are facing here in Santa Cruz and your plan for addressing those issues. And what I like to do is to have you spend, you have 15 minutes to do that. And then anything else you want us to know. And then we'll turn it over to our audience here and for questions. Does that sound okay? Okay, we're going to go with Joy. I'm going to ask you to go first.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And I may not speak, I probably won't speak for the entire 15 minutes because I would really like to have the Q&A. I love
Great.
that idea of having more of a conversation. So I will answer the other question. I'll get to the top three issues, but I'll also answer the other thing you threw out there, which is why I'm running for mayor. And I've been doing community organizing for many years. Most recently in Santa Cruz, I've been doing work with people who live outside in two particular projects. One, the Sanitation for the People, grew out of a mutual aid project where we were distributing necessary items to people who lived outside. And I joined when that group was going to the Highway 1 and 9 intersection once a week. And I began Sanitation for the People because the issues of waste management and sanitation were so lacking at that site. And through conversations with people who live outside, we decided to help people clean up in a non-judgmental way, working side by side. And we did that for a year, 40 cleanups, some that we worked on the city with, but many of them was just us on Sunday mornings, helping with one campsite at a time. And I've gotten to know people personally who live outside and consider them my friends. A separate project, but with overlapping interest, is Santa Cruz Cares, where when the city council majority was putting forward the camping standards and services ordinance and then the oversized vehicle ordinance, we found each other. We were calling in to contest the city council's plans, and a group of us found each other and started meeting to resist more formally. And I'm very proud of that work, including being part of the appeal to the Coastal Commission of the oversized vehicle ordinance. And those experiences really helped to drive home for me how important budgeting is and how important these ordinances are in the living conditions, including people's survival. And I want to take that care work, community work, to another level. So for me, thinking about electoral politics and running for mayor, it's an extension of the care work that I've been doing for 20 years, an extension of mutual aid work. I believe that our budget should be a people's budget that cares for people, and that our policies should reflect our values, not of a minority, but of a majority. And I think that when we write an ordinance, that ordinance really should be to make life better for people and to care for people better, not to punish people. So that's really the path that I've taken to this point to run for mayor. So to move on to your actual question, what do I consider my top three issues? Well, my tagline is justice in all things: housing, jobs, and environment. And I think that really for most people in Santa Cruz, Housing and homelessness are really top of the list. That comes up all the time from all different perspectives, including helping people who don't have housing, helping people who are precariously housed to keep them from becoming unhoused, people who are middle class who feel anxious about their own living situation in a variety of ways. And labor, we know that people are underpaid and overworked in our city and rent burdened, the majority of our residents. And we've just recently had our city's lowest paid workers almost go on strike. It was just averted at the last minute. And while I think they signed a good deal, I think that process showed that those workers aren't getting the respect that they need. They're not getting the support in their workplaces. They're not getting the equipment that they need, and they're not getting the levels of staffing that they need. So that's a highly visible and obvious place to start, is with our own city workers to address those conditions. I know they're in a contract now, but we can always do better, and we can look forward to the next time contract negotiations are in place. And I think, we have a lot of workers that aren't unionized in our town. We have a lot of service workers, undocumented workers who have no job protections, really. So I would like to see our town become stronger in its union protections and worker protections. And in terms of the environment, I think that's an issue for a lot of people. We have a climate action plan now, which I think has some hopeful directions in it, but it's not detailed enough. It's not fast enough. It's not bold enough for the crisis that we know that we're in. There's some low-hanging fruit that we could target, like getting off-road vehicles, which include leaf blowers. We could go faster than the state's mandate for phasing those out. And then we could work on much more justice being part of that plan for our frontline communities, like people without housing, like people who live in the Beach Flats neighborhood that are on the really already experiencing the negative effects of sea level rise. So that, in brief, very briefly, those are my top issues. I have many other issues that I think are important to me. It's very hard to choose just three, but it's like an obligation. So that's the big picture for me. And I think that we do have an opportunity here to reframe the kinds of community conversations that we're having, to rethink the way that we're doing community engagement, so that instead of having, say, consultants that are paid $200,000 or $400,000 a year to do some online surveys or some community sessions that may be just online, or maybe one or two meetings, I think that we can really, really do a better job of reaching everyday people who may not be involved in groups like this, but they still care about their communities and deserve to know. Like, for example, this change to district elections, as I canvass, there are quite highly educated people that still do not understand that we're moving to district elections and a mayor. People are confused between the Board of Supervisors districts and the city districts. They don't know which district they live in. So I carry a district map with me, and that's part of the conversation that I'm having with people very often. And I think it shows that the city hasn't done a very good job in that outreach. There was, out of 36,000 voters, there were only a few hundred that were really going to community meetings. So we need to really think about how we want to increase representation and engage people. And that may mean using some of the community groups that are already doing the work to lead other neighborhoods in doing similar work. For example, just door knocking. We have a community group that's doing that in their neighborhood south of Ocean Street. And this is something that we can do effectively and build relationships in our communities and inform people and hear from them so that there's a two-way street. That I think is something that's really fundamental to really bringing people back into the processes of governance. And through that, I think that's the only way that we can increase trust and a feeling. People need to feel like they're being heard, not just given the opportunity to chime in, but they really need to feel listened to and heard, so that they feel that there is trust, accountability, and transparency from their representatives. So I'm going to stop there because I feel like I'm rambling, and I do want to hear questions. I hope I get some good, hard questions about community safety and emergency response and all sorts of things like that.
Thank you, Joy. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Fred? It is 8:01.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Brenda and the NAACP, for hosting this opportunity for Joy and myself to be able to speak to a range of issues about which the community is very interested. Let me start with answering Brenda's question with regard to top issues. It's an area where Joy and I think have a lot of common ground and agree on what this suite of issues happens to be. I think that without a doubt, homelessness, affordable housing, drought proofing our water system in the context of climate change, I think that there are productive things we can and should do. The city council and the mayor a couple of years ago put together something called the Council Advisory Committee on Homeless, and they appointed folks experiencing homelessness, community members. Every city council member had 2 appointees, and then the body itself added some others who were additional folks experiencing homelessness. The council and the mayor asked me if I would be the convener of that activity, which is to say the presiding officer without a vote. In other words, help them get their work done. And it's called the Catch. And the Catch worked for about a year and dove very, very deeply into the issue of folks experiencing homelessness. And it was an edifying and illustrative and educational experience, I believe, for all involved. It helped a large group of folks and then the city council understand the challenges are not only 1 or 2 or 3 challenges for the folks who are experiencing homelessness, but that there are a very wide variety of experiences that have led folks to the situation they find themselves in. One of the very positive aspects, I think, of the Catch was that it helped both the city and the county understand what their roles are. Cities and counties are both local government, but they don't do the same things. Cities, for example, are not designed to provide primary health and human services. That's what counties do in California. They deliver TANF and Medi-Cal and other health and human services that are authorized by both the federal government and the state government. Those are then delivered by counties. Cities can choose, which ours does from time to time, to provide some funding in that social service area. But primarily that's the job of counties. And the Catch did a lot of, I think, quite good work drawing that distinction. In other words, not having both the county and the city duplicating each other or trying to, but the county deliver effective health, human services, and other social services to folks experiencing homelessness, while the city is primarily involved in this particular issue in terms of building things. And specifically, the Catch recommended that the city figure out how it is they could provide the brick and mortar for shelter, for navigation center, and for permanent supportive housing. And those are the top three city priorities for me, if I were to become mayor, is to help the city and its constituents get to a place where we can fund those three capital outlay activities that both the Catch and the city council and the board of supervisors and the county agree is the right distribution of which part of government does what. On affordable housing, as you probably know, there is something called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. This is a state statute. And what the statute does is it takes in the aggregate the needs for new housing, very low, low, moderate, above moderate, and market rate housing, and says, here for the next 8 years is your number for how many of each of those categories you, the city of Santa Cruz or Capitola or whomever it happens to be, here is your set of numbers in terms of how many units in each of those you should be managing towards in terms of construction. A couple of years ago, actually 3 years ago, John Lane, former mayor of Santa Cruz, he and I co-authored Measure H, which was an affordable housing bond. Now, it was on the ballot countywide, so it was inside the 4 cities as well as the unincorporated area. And it would have provided bond funding to build very low, low-income housing in the 4 cities and in the county of Santa Cruz. It needed 2/3 vote because it would have raised property taxes to retire the bonds. So it needed 66.6%. Countywide, it got about 53%. So it missed by a mile countywide. But where it didn't miss was in the city of Santa Cruz, where it got 70%. So I think what's helpful and instructive there is that we know what the voters of the city of Santa Cruz will do to tax themselves to build shelter, navigation center, permanent supportive housing, and very low and low income housing to meet the RHNA obligations or state obligations that every city and every county has. I think that if I were fortunate enough to become the mayor, task of mine will be to work with my colleagues and the community to fashion a measure for the 2024 ballot to do exactly that. The issue of public safety, I think, is also a major issue in the country. And certainly after the murder of George Floyd, there was an effort, I think, to rethink whether or not everything we expect out of our police department is a reasonable expectation. Are there opportunities? And Joy and I've talked about this, and I think it's another area where we have some agreement, and that is that there are programs in other communities in the country which combine police officer work with social worker work, so that on certain dispatches to 911, not everyone, but certain categories of dispatching, it's two responses. One is a police response, one is a social service response. I think that's a very thoughtful way to deal with many of the issues that we see in our community that may not need only a police response to them. I wanted to also mention on that public safety issue that when two police officers were murdered in our city on duty a few years ago, the city council and the mayor at that time also put together a public safety task force, and they each appointed members to that body. And again, they asked me if what I would do is be the convener, which is to say, again, the presiding officer without a vote, help them get their work done. And their report to the city council, I think much like the catch, was quite helpful in understanding issues such as the one I raised about being able to do dual dispatching when the particular call is the right thing to do. I do think that Measure D, which was on the June ballot, and that was put there by Greenway, which in my view was neither green nor the way, but Greenway was an attempt to kill rail transportation between Santa Cruz and Watsonville. The voters several years ago adopted a measure which said we are going to do several things and we're going to raise our sales taxes to do it. The voters approved this. We're going to do certain things on road maintenance, certain things with the transit district, certain things in various parts of the county with regard to transportation and transit. But the two big pieces of it were highway widening and intercity rail between Santa Cruz and Watsonville. What Greenway wanted to do was take out the part that involved rail transit between Santa Cruz and Watsonville and only keep the highway widening. And the reason I have some experience with this is because, again, in 2006, I believe, when I returned from my service in the legislature, Marty Wormhout was county supervisor at the time, and she was on the Transportation Commission. And she and the commission passed a resolution to create a transportation funding task force. And again, they appointed almost 100 people to this. Think about that, 100 people on a task force. And they gave them a year to come up with a transportation funding plan. And they asked me again if I would be the convener, presiding officer without a vote, help them get their work done. And we did produce, they produced, and I assisted them in producing what became the measure that the voters approved overwhelmingly to create this multi-strategy in dealing with our transit and transportation needs. And the key to that was having that intercity rail. So when Greenway came along and put the measure on the June ballot, I felt that it was a terrible disservice to the public and especially low-income persons of color, because that's who's going to primarily be served by this rail. And it's going to include other folks. There's going to be all kinds of folks in there, but low-income persons of color, largely in Watsonville and elsewhere in our county, this will provide them with a direct link between jobs and housing. And so I was proud to be able to assist in that and to play a major role in defeating Measure D on the June ballot. I'd like to talk about a couple other issues. I want to talk a little bit about environmental justice, which is one of your issues on your website. For over 100 years in California, when the voters were asked to approve park and environmental protection bonds, they largely were bonds, multi-million-dollar bond measures, and they mostly ended up being for buying big landscape properties in the state. And when I was in the assembly as Speaker Pro Tem to Speaker Antonio Villaraigosa of Los Angeles, who represented the most park-poor community in the state of California, we got together and said, at least half of every one of these park and environmental protection bonds going forward needs to be spent on inner city parks, pocket parks, recreational parks, parks that serve underserved communities throughout the state of California. And so I authored the largest park and environmental protection bond in California history. And it was framed exactly that way. And the voters approved it. It needed a majority vote. We got 57% yes votes statewide. 2 years later, Antonio and I wrote a second bond, even bigger, doing exactly the same thing. And the voters approved that by 57%. And today, in every urban area in California, there are inner city parks that didn't exist before. In other words, dealing with environmental justice when it comes to allocating public resources and setting in place a pattern that is still respected to this day. Going forward, there is not going to be park bonds that don't have, in other words, there will always be park and environmental protection bonds that fairly allocate the funding so that underserved communities can continue to be addressed with regard especially to parks and recreation for inner city youth.
Okay, there I am. Yeah, so I had a question about how both candidates what would you do with to help rent burdened tenants in the city of Santa Cruz? That's kind of part one. And part two, for Measure M in 2018, what were your sentiments then and what are your sentiments now? Measure M 2018 was the Tenant Protections Act in the, yeah. So yeah, whoever wants to go first, yeah.
So Measure M, the Tenant Protection Act, I was for it. Absolutely, I voted for it. And I think that it was defeated mostly because our town got a PAC and got tens of thousands of dollars in donations from real estate associations and developers to far outspend the community initiative to defeat it. We live in a town that's 60% renters, and those people need protections. Now, after Measure M was defeated, there was an effort to have just cause eviction on the agenda at City Council, so that at least renters could have that one very basic protection, that there has to be a good reason for them to be evicted. And it was never allowed to get on the agenda. It was tabled and never brought back. So I would like to see tenant protections on City Council agendas. And maybe some people are afraid of tenant protections. But people need that protection. The majority of our renters, so the majority of people that live in our town are renters, about 60%. And the majority of those people are rent burdened, many paying 60% of their wages to rent. That is not sustainable for a community. And we know that because we see people struggling and we see our friends and family leaving. So we, for decades, have defunded our social safety nets and overinvested in market rate housing. Our inclusionary rate is too low. If you think of the housing that's being built, it's kind of like a pyramid, right? And right now, the base of the pyramid is market rate, and the tip is the affordable. We need to turn that upside down so that the base of our housing is affordable for just like regular people working regular jobs. I'm not even talking, I mean, certainly the most poor people have had the least amount of housing built for them. Go back and look at the RENA numbers for the last, well, at least since the 90s, and you'll see that we've built the absolute minimum of housing for the people with the least amount of money. And most of that housing has been small, like SROs, very small. So people who live in those units are more likely to be isolated, more likely to be in an overcrowded situation if it's, for example, a single mother with a child. They're more likely to be women. They're more likely to live on polluted traffic corridors. So we need housing equity in a major way in order to protect people. And that housing equity and those tenant protections, they need to go together. And the focus on building affordable housing, truly affordable housing over market rate housing, that has to be part of the picture too. We need to increase the supply of affordable housing, not the supply of market rate housing. We've built enough market rate housing in the last few decades, for several decades to come, when you look at those RENA numbers. So let me just wrap it up here. Yes, I support Measure M. Yes, I support more tenant protections. If we have to start with the bare minimum of just cause eviction and work our way up from there, fine. We can be incremental about it.
Well, since I've been in Santa Cruz, rent control has been on the ballot at least once every decade. So that means that it's been on the ballot 5 times since I've lived in this community. And every single time, whether it was underfunded or overfunded, the realtors got in really big, like they did on Measure M, or it was more of a fair fight or not, the community every single time has said no to rent control. I find it perplexing. It's the second most unaffordable community in the United States, and in our community, a progressive / liberal community, that we can't get, even as Joy indicated, a just cause eviction ordinance, much less a rent control ordinance adopted in our community. Now, I think that there are a lot of reasons for that, but what is it that, in the face of the voters saying no, what is it we do then? If the voters at any one of those elections had said yes, then you know what you do. But if the voters keep saying no, 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 no to it, for whatever reasons, then we have to find another way to deal with the challenge of folks who are in the rent community and are rent burdened. And it does seem to me that one of the areas where the city has authority, and I think it's important to recognize the city is not the federal government, the state government, or the county government. It has limited authorities on what it can do. But what it can do is it can put together an affordable housing bond that is largely directed to very low and low income housing. Because what the folks who work in the nonprofit housing sector will tell you, and you know this, is that after they've cobbled together density bonuses, federal tax credits, state tax credits, they are still $150,000 to $250,000, and I'll repeat that, $150,000 to $250,000 per unit short of being able to pencil out that particular project. So in order to make those projects work at the very low and low income level, there needs to be a source of funding. I believe that between now and 2024, in open, transparent discussions throughout the community, we can fashion such a bond to do that, that will help us hit our RENA numbers on the very low and low. I think it's right. On moderate and market rate and above, city government doesn't need to do anything there. And that the market forces drive that, but the market forces ignore the very low and low. So I think that that is the way to move forward and make real progress on the issues that are facing renters in Santa Cruz, given what the available tools are in the toolbox for city government.
Okay, my question is probably mostly for Fred. I understand that while Joy has agreed to the voluntary spending limit or expenditure limit, that you have not. And I'm wondering why you decided not to agree to the voluntary spending limit for this election.
Sure, glad to talk about that. There are two limits by the city. One is voluntary, one is mandatory. The mandatory limit relates to contributions. You can't receive more than $400 from any individual or a PAC or anything else. And so what I've done is said that for the most part, except for those entities like labor unions that are endorsing my candidacy, for example, SEIU that just settled its contract has endorsed my candidacy, the Building Trades Council, basically organized labor is supporting my candidacy. So when they send me a $400 check, I deposit it. Individual contributions, I'm self-limiting to $250, $150 below the contribution limit. That's my issue there. As to the voluntary spending limit, here's why I did not take it. When I had to make that decision, I did not know, because you have to do that prior to the close of filing. And prior to the close of filing, I didn't know who all would file. Joy was filing, I knew that. But there may be other folks who were going to file. And I thought it was a mistake in this first citywide election to tie my hands in the event that there were substantial candidates in the race who could either self-fund or could count on independent expenditures, or who were fundraisers beyond that who didn't share the same ideology and perspective about government that I view and that I have. So that's was my reasoning at the time that I had to take or not take the spending limit. What I can tell you is that I will not spend above the spending limit.
Thank you, Fred.
I'm going to take the call. I'm Laura Lee. He's here,
Okay.
but I'm the one that get asked it to both candidates. I've been recently made aware of all the big planning building projects, including the skyscrapers and the arena and the overbuilding, in my view, that's being planned for Santa Cruz, that highly commercializes our town. And it looks like with the intent to draw more people here, when we can't even we can't even get into town with all the traffic. And it's deeply troubling when I see this overexpansion without concern for being able to handle the traffic, handle the congestion, the noise, and the water supply. So I would like each candidate to speak to how much building they think is appropriate and how tall a buildings they feel is appropriate. And I'd like to also get their ideas of where they would put the affordable housing, because from what I'm looking at is they're trying to put a lot of affordable housing right downtown when it could be distributed throughout the town and out the county. And so people are integrated more into neighborhoods rather than to overbuild again in a small space. And it just closed by thanking the NAACP for hosting this event. It's important for us to learn the candidates' views. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will ask Joy, since Fred answered the last question, Joy, if you will start. And if you both can try to keep your answers to 2 minutes. I don't want to keep us here till 10, but
Okay.
this is important.
Yeah, it is. And it's hard, some of these issues are so complex that it is really challenging to have a short answer. I'll say that I really think that we do need some building and development and densification of our neighborhoods. It has to be balanced with environmental issues and neighborhood concerns. And what's being described as the new neighborhood south of Laurel, that's already a neighborhood. The city council has approved, I can't remember if it's 1,400 or 1,600 units, but out of that, only about 200 are going to be affordable. Now, that's what I'm talking about when I say that we barely fulfill our RENA numbers for the most affordable units, or even up to, moderately affordable, and we overbuild market rate. So I agree with you, Vivian, that affordable housing shouldn't be ghettoized and concentrated in single neighborhoods. I think neighborhoods that are already diverse socioeconomically, like that south of Laurel neighborhood, need to have that diversity respected and maintained. So whatever is built there should be adding to and serving the neighborhood that is already there, and it should be community led. And when we, the state, we have a lot of, we have a legacy of racist zoning that we can get rid of, like single family home zoning, like just do away with that. And then we can have infill in other established neighborhoods. And if those neighborhoods aren't already socioeconomically diverse, then that infill and densification can help bring diversity to it, especially if we're really focusing on affordable housing. And transportation justice has to go along with it. When we densify an area or build in an area like that south of Laurel zone, we need to be working out our transportation issues in advance of that, or at the same time. For example, having satellite parking with a free trolley like other towns do. We already have excessive parking on, say, like the Ironman weekend. You don't want to drive anywhere through downtown or by the beach. So let's plan for that now before we build thousands of additional units and new commercial spaces. Let's invest in the neighborhoods that we already have. Let's invest in the downtown that's suffering currently. Let's make the buildings that we have better and better used. That's the most fiscally responsible and environmentally friendly way to invest in our communities.
Thank you.
Well, I think this is an area where we're really talking about what is Santa Cruz going to become? This is the third wave in the modern era of Santa Cruz. First, the University of California came to town, completely changed our community. Then we had the earthquake in 1989, completely changed things all over the county and especially in downtown Santa Cruz. And we did a very good thing after the earthquake. We spent a year with Marty Wormhout in the lead as the mayor of Santa Cruz in putting a community effort together to figure out what do we rebuild and retain and what do we build anew. And not everybody agrees with what the outcome was, but there was broad consensus about what our downtown looked like now after the rebuild and new buildings after the earthquake. I think we're in the third phase. I think we're in a phase right now where Joy said it, I said it, you can talk to any council candidate, they're all going to say the top two issues for them are homelessness and affordable housing. Everybody says that. The question becomes, how do you do it? I think there's a political reality to deal with here. When 100% affordable housing was proposed 2 blocks from where I live, other neighbors, not me, other neighbors organized to oppose it. And they had all kinds of reasons why it was wrong as far as they were concerned in their neighborhood. And this is not an isolated situation. Every candidate talks about a building affordable housing. And now with districts in the city of Santa Cruz, you're going to still hear that. But I will predict that what they really mean is in somebody else's district, because that's how they behave. That's how councils have always behaved. And I don't think they're going to be any different simply because it's district elections. In fact, I think it's going to aggravate that. So what do you do about it? The one place where consensus could be agreed upon and found is going to be south of Laurel. If you want to build a new neighborhood, and Joy and I don't see this issue the same. I don't think that the tire dealer and the Warriors Arena and a used car dealer and an abandoned CVS and so on, I don't believe that's a neighborhood in the context of what we think of as neighborhoods. I think it's a prime place for us to build a new neighborhood and do it the right way as Santa Cruz can do it. Not like San Jose does it or some other community, how we could do it. Why don't we model the best way to do it using the most modern construction techniques and materials to account for climate change? Can we, in fact, and I believe the answer is yes, spur economic development downtown by having ground floor commercial and retail and residential above, with lots of it being affordable? For at least 30 years in this community, there has been an effort to say, stop turning our back to the San Lorenzo River. All the buildings along the San Lorenzo River have their back to it. Bruce Van Allen and others have talked for decades about turning our face to the river, in making the river the pumping veins and arteries of our community. I think this is a wonderful opportunity to do that if we do it right. And rather than say, gee, I don't know if we can exactly do it right, so we shouldn't do it. I think we've done great things in this community. When we fought offshore oil drilling, we didn't settle for saying, well, there isn't going to be any. That's wonderful. We went ahead and did the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. We've figured out just how to say yes in the correct way in the city of Santa Cruz, and we can say yes to that. We can say yes, we are going to take the political reality of most council members, understand that there is going to be opposition to affordable housing in their districts. And if you don't think that's the case, I'd be glad to have a long argument with you about it, because there's very little evidence that there's anything but that, not only in Santa Cruz, but almost every city. So where can you do it? Where can you find the consensus? And I think that that is in what I would call the new downtown neighborhood south of Laurel.
Thank you, Fred. Vivian?
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I wrote it out also in the chat and Joy answered it, so maybe this is more for Fred. How do you plan to involve Latinos in the decision-making process in our city? And please be specific.
I think there's a couple of very specific things that we can and should do. First is, one of the most effective ways I've seen over the years in the city and in the county is by bringing underrepresented communities into the committee and commission process of those two local governments. That the committees and commissions that the board already has under ordinance need to reflect the community, and largely most of them do not. And I think that takes an affirmative act by the city council. I've done that on every board that I serve on in the wake of the George Floyd murder. I have made it a personal commitment to onboard persons of color and underrepresented communities on the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary Foundation Board, on the Semper Virens Fund, on Working Partnerships USA, and on Housing Santa Cruz County. And I've been successful with that. Because if you want folks to be engaged and have power, then you get them into the system where in fact they can exercise that power. And I think that that's a major way that we can deal effectively in the underrepresentation that goes on in our boards and commissions, which are the incubators for leadership in our community.
I'd like to add something, if I may, to my answer in the chat. I would say that I think it's really important to address the material inequities that keep people from positions of power. So it's not just an issue of representation, it's an issue of supporting materially people's needs so that they have the time, the money, the energy to be involved. And that means that people have stable jobs, stable housing, childcare. And if they're low income, they may need a stipend to be on a commission. It is a hell of a lot of work to keep up with city politics, just like even as a person without a regular job. So imagine somebody who's doing housekeeping work, multiple jobs, kids to look after, all sorts of things. How is that person going to get to meetings? I think that that's something that needs to be talked about above and beyond just representation if we want to truly increase it. And I think you don't get those material equality until you look at the intersectionality of all these issues and how they fit together.
Thank you. Sean?
Hello, Sean Trum, disabilities advocate. You both have Rail Defenders endorsements. But Fred, you're endorsed by Shebra, whose endorsement page is a who's who of Greenway and Measure D 2022. Shebra ran the 2017 Vision Santa Cruz County meetings across the county and heard in person from nearly every person there that traffic and roads were their top two priorities. And she, Jimmy Dutra, and her wealthy supporters continue their work to end our rail project. Now, as mayor, part of your job would be to support some of your allies' projects. That's where you'll put public money, is towards your allies' projects. We need inclusive infrastructure, not racist infrastructure. I've witnessed statements made by the author of Measure D and the former executive director of Greenway, who sits on the RTC. I've witnessed their racist statements that they've made. it absolutely matters who your allies' partners are. Because when you work with them, they're working with somebody else. Now, their work to end the rail is poison for the will of the people. 20 plus years of planning. It comes up all the time in lots of meetings I attend. How is it that you want to work with her as she and her allies continue this insane agenda to pull up the rails against all the warnings from our 5 CZU fire directors and fire chiefs telling us how dangerous it's going to be? There's a lot there. But yeah, tell me why you want to work with her and her people. Thank you.
Well, let's talk about Measure D. Measure D got on the ballot by a well-funded campaign by one single Silicon Valley refugee who came to Santa Cruz and decided that he should have more than anybody else to say about what happens on our transportation and transit systems. When I chaired the Transportation Funding Task Force for the Transportation Commission, we came up with a multi-use plan, including the rail. I was, together with 2 other people, the leads on the No on Greenway campaign. I raised over $100,000 to defeat that terrible idea. I am fully committed to rail in Santa Cruz County because it is an environmental justice issue and it's a social justice issue. It has to do with how people can get to their jobs, how people can access economic opportunity. And so I was very proud to head up that effort that killed the Greenway project, which was a terrible, terrible idea to tear out after years of community work and consensus building about what our transit and transportation system should look like. And I was very proud to bring in the chair of the California Transportation Commission into our county to help explain why rail funding is absolutely possible to do and is being done all over the state of California. Carl Gardino, bringing in folks who had authored transportation initiatives in the state of California to oppose Greenway, so that what we ended up with was a great outcome. We ended up defeating Greenway, which was neither green nor the way, and a bunch of Silicon Valley elites who thought they knew better than everybody else in Santa Cruz got their head handed to them the way they should. And now we're back on track, so to speak, to get a multi-use transit and transportation future in Santa Cruz County. I'm very proud to have been part of the Transportation Funding Task Force that said that's what we should do, and very proud to be a leader in opposing Measure D on the June ballot and defeating it overwhelmingly, so that there's nobody in the county that thinks that somehow we should do everything except rail. Absolutely, rail transit in Santa Cruz County is a key to our environmental success in terms of greenhouse gas reduction and in terms of social and economic equity in transit and transportation.
With respect, Fred, why do you want to work? Why do you want Chevra as an ally? Because she's Team Greenway, and Greenway clearly does not care how many of our burn and how many people get sick.
You probably know this, but I have hundreds and hundreds of supporters in this campaign. Virtually every member of the city council, Sandy Brown included. Folks throughout the county in elected positions and appointed positions, and hundreds of other folks. I am not in the habit of saying to people, I won't talk to you or I won't work with you. I'm in the habit of saying, I do want to have an intelligent conversation about public policy issues and see if we can get someplace. There is no question about where am I on the transit and transportation question. When I was a county supervisor for 8 years, I served on both the Transportation Commission and the Transit Authority. Since I've been back in town from serving in the state legislature, I've worked very hard to get to the point that we're at right now, where we can have a realistic opportunity to get intercity rail, which is a climate change positive way to move goods and services around the county, and to deal with economic and societal inequities in terms of transit and transportation and job opportunities. I have hundreds of supporters, some of whom I see eye to eye with, some of whom I do not see eye to eye with, and I'm very pleased that hundreds and hundreds of people are endorsing my candidacy for mayor. And I don't say to anyone, you can't be part of this. I want to say to people, let's be part of this together. Let's deal with the top 5 issues that I've been speaking to in this campaign, which is homelessness, affordable housing, equitable transportation, drought-proofing our water system, and making sure that going forward, people can live and work in the same community, which they haven't been able to do for several decades in our town. And what we need to do on that is to pass affordable housing bonds, which I authored a couple of years ago, and now focus it in on the city of Santa Cruz and get the affordable housing support that we need, both in the homeless arena, as well as the very low and low income categories required of the city of Santa Cruz by the regional housing needs allocation of the state of California.
Thank you. Tim Fitzmaurice.
Hi, thank you to the candidates. I know it's hard to run for office, and I appreciate you putting yourself out there and working so hard. And I had questions that were in the chat. Are you supporting a yes on Measure O and N? And are you accepting contributions from developers? And I wanted to add something to the question about Latinos. When I was in office, I held commission meetings in Spanish, and then people that spoke English had to be translated. And it changed the whole nature of the situation. And I think the new mayor could come in there and say, we're going to hold some meetings in Spanish, and then if you want to, you're going to have to be translated the other way. It's going to work in the other direction. And let me tell you, it changed the whole character of the whole thing. And so people getting access to government is really affected by the way we deal with language. And we got to come to grips with this. And we're not doing it. We're not doing a good enough job of that. So I like that question. But are you supporting O and N? And are you accepting contributions from developers and realtors and such?
I publicly endorse both and yes on N and yes on O. I've been involved in the campaign for the empty home tax for over a year. And yes on no, I've more recently come around to that, but I've supported them and attended their launch. And I won't take money from developers or real estate organizations. And you can see I put a link in the chat, and that's a site that puts together all the campaign finance information for this year's campaigns in an easy to find place. So anybody on here can just check for themselves to verify where money comes from.
I'm not sure I tracked exactly which part of what you were saying was your question. Can you just rephrase it or phrase it again or say it again? I just want to know what your question is.
I just want to know if you're supporting a yes vote on Measure O and N.
Okay.
And I think, what was the other question? And the other question was
Campaign contribution.
Accepting contributions from developers and realtors, because I know they expect something in return. I learned that clearly when I was in office. I had to reject contributions, and it was horrible. They were nice people, and but they're transactional. That's just the way it is. Anyway, so I just want to know if people were accepting contributions from developers.
So with regard to the two ballot measures, I have taken the following position, that those got to the ballot by way of signature gathering, and those were qualified for the ballot before the opening of filing. I have taken the position that on a public facing basis, I'm staying out of those. I have provided, because I think that if you get there by way of the council putting something on the agenda, you're obligated to take a position. You've already taken a position because you either voted yes or no to put it on the ballot. But these got there by signature gathering. And I think that the pros and cons will play their way out in this conversation and during the election. I am very proud of my environmental record as a public official and as a state legislator. I also am very proud of my record as it relates to housing and affordable housing and economic development. I think on these two measures that are on the ballot, let me take them one at a time. Our Downtown, Our Future, which is a public matter, I am staying out of. But I also feel that it's okay for me to voice my opinion. My opinion about it, as opposed to a campaign view, which I am staying out of, is that Our Downtown, Our Future is a rather awkwardly constructed measure at best. I think that having a new library with affordable housing together with parking structure, which is much smaller than it was originally envisioned to be, is not a bad thing for the redevelopment of our downtown. I don't mean that in the context of government redevelopment. I mean the process of redeveloping our downtown. I don't see that as a bad thing at all. I think that it has a lot of merit to it, because I think that's where the city electorate is going generally, which, especially in this context of district elections, I see the downtown being the area that a lot of our non-residential and some residential aspirations are going to be met. I think it's pretty clear that neighborhoods are not real wild about a lot of new development within them. And the state of California, through two pieces of legislation, have largely eviscerated the ability of local governments to thoughtfully plan in residential neighborhoods. And I think what that leaves us with is a downtown that lets us focus our economic development as well as affordable housing and commercial and retail activity that's going to be beneficial to us as a community generally. So I think that on that measure, the voters will decide what they want to do. I'm not putting it on campaign literature or anything else. I'm just sharing my personal point of view about it. On the other measure, so we've got Our Downtown, Our Future over here, and we've got the other measure that Cindy and others are are working on right now. I think that with regard to Cindy's initiative, that it has merit to it. It's a thoughtful approach, but I don't know that the voters of the city of Santa Cruz are going to go there. I think our city, the electorate, has gone through an evolution in the recent 10, 15, 18 years. I think the city is changing in that the electorate favors, I believe, preserving neighborhoods, not overbuilding in them, and having a very vibrant downtown where if we are going to be doing a lot of new residential multifamily buildings with very low and low income housing in it, I think in a districted world, we're going to see that these individual council members are going to take some exception to a lot of, or very much at all, development, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, in their districts. And what they're going to do is politically shift development into the downtown, especially the south of Laurel area. And I think the challenge for the new mayor and the city council is how to work your way through that in such a way that the transit and transportation issues are adequately addressed, which I believe they will be, because you've got to do that in order for this to be a positive benefit to the community. I think that the new downtown neighborhood is a good idea for our community because, among other things, it provides a pressure release valve for those politicians who are representing neighborhoods more than the one representative who will largely represent downtown.
Okay, I want to read a question that's from the chat, and this is from Lonnie. What do you anticipate you can do as mayor to shift the pay rate so that Santa Cruz businesses pay employees a living wage? At $25 an hour, a person cannot afford rent, car, health insurance, food, and other expenses, especially if they have a family.
Like I said, I think I alluded to this before. I think Santa Cruz should be a union town, and we should be explicitly and proactively working on that coming from city leadership. I'd also like to see a lot more worker ownership, workers co-ops, and explicit support for that. We do have some successful worker-owned businesses. Community Printers is one that's long established, and another that's much younger is Hardcore Compost. And there's no reason why we can't have many, many more worker-owned organizations. I think we can incentivize raising wages and other benefits. We could also have a living wage ordinance that keeps pace with the rise of cost of living. It is a tricky one though, because things are so expensive. I mean, honestly, even $25 isn't a truly living wage. The housing wage is $60 an hour. You know, if you're a single parent with a child, to not be overcrowded, you would need a 2-bedroom apartment. You would need to be making $60 an hour to get that. And there aren't very many people who are, you know, below the median income who are making that much money.
Thank you.
Can you give me the question again?
Sure. Basically, I had asked the question to both of the candidates. What do you anticipate as mayor that you can do to shift the pay rate so that Santa Cruz businesses pay employees a living wage, even at $25 an hour, which isn't minimum wage here. A person cannot afford rent, car, health insurance, food, and other expenses, especially if they have a family to take care of. And I think that this really became clear to me when I left industry over the hill, and I looked for work here, and some of my friends, as myself, who have master's degree, had trouble finding work at anything much above $25 an hour. So it's really a struggle, and I think we're all pretty aware of it.
So Lonnie, the question is,
what do you anticipate that you can do to shift that so that that businesses are paying employees a living wage?
well, local government in California certainly does not establish the minimum wage, and done by the state of California. Cities can attempt to do some things themselves and in terms of their own government and those with whom they contract. They can also require certain pay rates and benefit packages and so on. I think there might be another way perhaps to look at this, and that is lowering on the cost side rather than trying to go in and place something on all the small businesses, because we are basically a small business community, and saying all small businesses need to raise their minimum wage to some level that the government decides on, the city government decides is a livable wage. I think that when studying the economics of the composition of our city, that is an absolute guarantee for an initiative to repeal that and potentially recall. I really believe that. I don't think that our small business base can all of a sudden overnight quadruple its payroll without increasing its productivity and somehow think that that's going to work out. It's not going to work out. I think the way to go at this is go at it the other way, which is to provide the subsidy side of the outrageous cost of housing in Santa Cruz. That is an issue that we can, in fact, do something about under the general laws and charter of the state of California and of the city of Santa Cruz. That's an area we can make some real progress on. And so I think that having high standards with regard to very low and low income housing in Santa Cruz is a better approach to that, because I believe that the politics of the other way to do it will be met with a resounding unified opposition from the very small businesses that are the heart of our community and who want to stay here and who provide a lot of employment, much of which is in the lower income areas. But to say that those folks have the obligation to cure the economics of the city of Santa Cruz is a mistake. And I don't think it'll work. And I think it would lead to, at a minimum, a ballot initiative and possibly more that is not going to be helpful in that regard.
Thank you, Fred. And I hear what you're saying. I do know that many of us are small business owners, and that would be difficult. So that makes sense.
Thank you. Maylin?
Thanks. Yeah, Mr. Keeley, I don't know if I heard you when I asked the first question. It was about Measure M in 2018. So I don't remember hearing whether you supported it or did not, whatever your position was. I didn't catch that.
I stayed out of it. I had another ballot measure that I was working very hard on that took up all my time. I didn't take a public position.
Okay, and I actually had a question about that measure. So it didn't, the one you were working on, I think it was age. So that was a bond measure you were working on with Don Lane, right? Anyway, that did not pass. Are there any lessons from that experience you want to
Yeah,
share?
I tried to explain that earlier, but I'll do it. I'll go back to it again. Measure H required a 2/3 vote countywide. And we spent quite a bit of time putting it together in public venues. It was an affordable housing bond with most of the funding going to very low and low and a little bit going to moderate income housing in Santa Cruz County. What we found out as a result of that when the election was held was that there were only 2 communities in which that had real purchase or real support: Watsonville and Santa Cruz. Everywhere else in the county, there was no support for that concept. So it seems to me that the right lesson to learn from that is that you put a measure on in the city of Santa Cruz, because the city of Santa Cruz approved that measure by 70% yes vote. So what that tells me is that our community is very willing to support an affordable housing bond for very low and low income individuals, and some of the brick and mortar side of homeless response. If it's put on the ballot, if it's negotiated publicly, if it has public participation, if it's transparent, and we can put that on the 2024 ballot, I think then we made real progress. And I think that that's entirely possible to do. I think the electorate is there in the city of Santa Cruz.
And just now that you're mentioning that, I think you were talking about like different parts of Santa Cruz, like near the Warriors Arena, and anticipating the response in those areas. Could you elaborate on that? You're talking about the willingness south of Laurel. So I know there's a lot of different neighborhoods. Maybe you could just elaborate on that. Like, how do you foresee something if you're thinking about proposing something in 2024, how do you anticipate that would work out in the different parts of the city?
So the idea, if we took measure, if we took the measure that was on the ballot a couple of years ago that succeeded in Santa Cruz and Watsonville, but didn't have a market for it apparently in between, I would see that it is a city of Santa Cruz publicly negotiated bond for very low and low income housing. So that, and what I was talking about with regard to south of Laurel is that there is the city, the current city council and administration has said, we want to take that area and subject a very large set of development proposals and subject that to environmental review. And that's what is underway right now. I'll make a prediction. My prediction is there aren't going to be any 17-story buildings. There aren't going to be high-rise developments. Now, it depends on what you call high-rise. One question is, do you think we have a high-rise in the city of Santa Cruz downtown right now? And I think that's a fair question to ask people is, do you think that anything that's been built downtown Santa Cruz is a high-rise? People talking 17-story and 20-story buildings, which was submitted for environmental review, I predict it will come back and say that's way overbuilding downtown. But I think where the city is likely to get is that a new residential, commercial, and retail neighborhood between Laurel and Beach Hill, about 4 blocks wide, about 6 blocks long, that is an area that I believe the people of the city of Santa Cruz and the voters of the city of Santa Cruz, if it is appropriately sized and it doesn't turn its back to the river, and it does provide employment opportunities, and it does provide affordable housing in significant numbers, none of that has been resolved to date. The only thing that has happened on this is that the city has subjected to environmental review under the California Environmental Quality Act a very large proposal. I don't believe for a minute that that's what's going to end up getting built. I think the environmental impact report's going to come back and show some areas where that doesn't make sense. But I think as a concept, building a new neighborhood south of Laurel that is going to have significant amounts of affordable housing and job opportunities is a very good idea for our city. And I suspect that's where the electorate is going to go as well.
Thank you. Jane Doyle, did you have a follow-up question?
Joy had mentioned when when she spoke about south of Laurel, that the proposal has 20%, I believe, for low-income housing in south of Laurel. And Fred, you just said that you thought they were going to have a significant amount of it. So I'm not sure which of you should address this, but 20% doesn't strike me, given our other statistics for housing in Santa Cruz, does not strike me as particularly a lot. So I'm not sure if I'm right about the numbers.
Why don't we have Joy answer?
Well, with the density bonus, these buildings will in effect have about 10% affordable housing in them. So that's from my perspective, that is completely out of proportion to what we need. By definition, if the AMI is 50% of the people are under that and 50% of the people are over that, well, then 50% of the housing should be built for the 50% of the people that need it. If you build 10% or even 20% of the housing for 50% of the people to scrabble over, you will have a housing crisis, you will have precarious rent burdened people, and you will have visible homelessness and struggling social services. Like, that is just math. I don't understand why this is like contentious for anybody when the city council majority repeatedly refuses to raise the inclusionary ordinance even to 25%. That's still not enough, but I'll leave my comments there.
Is there a question? I'm sorry.
Yes, what you had made a statement where you used there would be a lot or significant or something. I'm sorry, I don't remember which word, about the amount of affordable low-income housing in south of Laurel. And I'm wondering what you mean by that in numbers or percentages.
Well, I'll tell you what I mean by it. And this is not consistent with the current city policy. I think that the minimums that are established under the ordinance, affordable housing ordinance and development ordinances in the city of Santa Cruz will not get us anywhere near where we need to be in terms of housing affordability. When I work with the various nonprofit housing organizations who are members of Housing Santa Cruz County, of which I was a founding member, which grew out of the Measure H housing bond. And we started focusing in on both Watsonville and Santa Cruz as target areas because they both voted more than 2/3 in favor of that, which meant if you had put it on separately in those cities, it would have passed. I think that the city of Santa Cruz will need to negotiate with the developers of both the housing and the retail and commercial. But I think that the strength that we have in that regard in negotiations is that we have very experienced, very good nonprofit housing developers who can come in and true up that difference. Because Joy is absolutely right about what happens on density bonuses. What it lets you do is build more by doing a little bit more on affordable housing. You get to do a lot more on market rate.
Right.
And that doesn't spin the public policy in the direction sufficiently to make a dent in the housing affordability issue in Santa Cruz. So I think that we are at the very beginning steps of whether or not there is a new neighborhood south of Laurel, and if so, what that neighborhood is going to look like. I think it's a good thing that that's going to happen in concept as a new neighborhood downtown. And again, I think it provides a place that is politically going to satisfy a lot of other issues that could be very contentious. For example, again, the 831 Water Street project is going to be held up as, by some folks, as an example of really bad state public policy through SB 35,
Right.
which basically takes out of the hands of the city the ability to do anything except have objective standards. You cannot have subjective standards for considering that kind of proposal. If you want to get away from that is going to intrude on neighborhoods, then you have to create the opportunity someplace else. And rather than sacrificing residential neighborhoods, creating a positive extension of our downtown by 4 blocks or 5 blocks, to me makes very good sense from a planning perspective. And I think we're going to end up with a lot more affordable housing as a consequence. But I believe that that's still a negotiation in the future, because no decision making short of advancing this overly large process to environmental review is not the same thing as approving a project, which is probably 2 to 3 years away, and negotiations between the city and those who want to develop that new neighborhood downtown.
Thank you, Fred. And we're going to take one last question, and then we'll give Fred and Joy an opportunity for closing statements.
This is Chris, and I live near the south of Laurel neighborhood, just next to it. So I want to offer a perspective of why pick this neighborhood. We're already very impacted with high density already. It's like picking on a poor neighborhood because there's a lot of renters in this neighborhood. There's not a lot of homeowners in this neighborhood. So to select this neighborhood for, possibly they're talking 17 stories is one of the plans. So I want to know Joy's stance. I'd like to hear more of Joy's voice. Haven't heard a lot, but from both of you, can you limit growth? We're in a unique situation in Santa Cruz where we rely on surface water for our water. We're in the 3rd year of a severe drought, and these droughts are going to increase with our climate crisis. So what about limits on growth? We have UCSC that is, going for, unlimited growth, and mostly in my neighborhood in south of Laurel, we have students filling these neighborhoods. So it makes it unlivable for workers like myself, because the students are very noisy. They have parties at 1 a.m. on a Wednesday. So I want you to imagine also with the climate crisis, how do we evacuate all these people when we've gone up 17 stories, when we have a fire? We don't have the road space. We don't have the water for the current population. So please share your thoughts about unlimited growth and these large developments that are being pressed by developers and mostly out of the area developers. In our area, there was a developer, they wanted to go up several stories, and they were from South Carolina. So please give me your thoughts on growth limits that are within, creating livable communities. Because right now, south of Laurel there's no parking. You cannot find parking on the street, and people park all the time in front of our driveways because there's not parking now. So when the apartment provides one parking space and 6 students move into the apartment, this is from my personal experience, and there are 5 cars on the road because that apartment complex didn't provide enough parking. How do we create these large developments and we don't have the infrastructure?
Thank you, Chris.
Sorry, that's a complex question, and I think we don't have time to talk about it super in depth. But as I mentioned before, I think we need to be careful in our development. I think we do need to densify some things, I think it would be best if we densify to a degree through infill and through some taller buildings, probably not super tall, but I think it needs to be done carefully because every building project has an environmental cost to it, with the building materials, with the transportation associated with it, with the traffic impacts. I think we should really be focused on building the most essential things new, and as much as possible, we should be using what we already have built. In terms of the sort of some of the infrastructure issues like water, there's like a sweet spot of water water efficiency with mid-rise buildings, and I believe it's somewhere in the 4 to 8 story range. So I think that we can build in ways that are more energy efficient and water efficient, but not endlessly. And also, where are those building materials going to come from? Are they going to come from a place like Eurostack? We have so many sacrifice zones in our world already. We have to keep in mind that wherever these materials come from, those are more sacrifice zones. At the same time, we also have people that are being sacrificed because of the system, this profit-driven system that we have, and the hyper financialization of housing. So we can't sacrifice them either. So striking that balance is going to be difficult, and I think it should be project to project. It's a pain in the ass, but I think this is why we need CEQA and community review. No, it's not efficient, but it's important. So that's my basic answer to that very, very complex question. I think also in terms of parking, we need to be getting away from car culture and parking. This is one reason why I don't think we should be building the parking garage that's part of the mixed use proposal. We need to be getting away from cars more and more and investing in really high quality, frequent, low cost or free public transportation. And if we make public transportation great, like in so many other places in the world, then we don't need so many cars. So that will help with environmental justice and transportation justice and economic justice.
Thank you.
Would you be kind enough to restate the heart of your question?
Yes, I asked about growth and what are your thoughts on unlimited growth, especially around the areas of providing water, parking, and not building just in a poor neighborhood because our voice isn't as powerful.
Got it. Thank you. When I moved to Santa Cruz in 1977, after I graduated from San Jose State, the very next year, Measure J was on the ballot, which was the county's growth management ordinance. At that time, the county of Santa Cruz was on the verge of being overrun by the most powerful economic engine in the world, the Silicon Valley. And when I came to town, I immediately jumped into that campaign to get Measure J adopted countywide, which set growth limits on the city, on the county on an annual basis. And it prohibited the county from growing faster than the state of California. You could adopt a lower rate, but you couldn't adopt a higher rate. And on the Board of Supervisors, I spent my 2 terms on the Board of Supervisors working with Gary Patton and others to make sure that that ordinance had real teeth and real purchase to it, and it really worked. A couple of years later, in the city of Santa Cruz in the early 1980s, City of Santa Cruz put a green belt initiative on the ballot for the same purpose, to manage our growth. Now, what we did really well was that we managed our growth really well. We limited the number of building permits that were given out. We prohibited annexations outside the green belt. When I came to Santa Cruz, right before Measure J, the city was proposing to build a community of 30,000 people by annexing the western edge of the city all the way to Davenport and putting a nuclear power plant at Davenport. None of that happened because a combination of Measure J and the green belt managed our growth. That was the case for decades. And it was a really important thing to do, or today we would look like the Orange County coast, and we don't, because we made a different choice. But there was a problem with what we did, and that is that we promised to protect the environment. We promised to manage our growth, but what we didn't do is we didn't keep up with the requirement or the need for very low and low income housing. And as a consequence of limiting the supply and not limiting the demand, the housing market has gone stark raving nuts for the last 3 decades. So the question becomes, then what do you do about that? Because we do have growth management. We have growth management in the city and the county. And so the question becomes exactly the one that you raise, which is that the outcome of that has been the outcome we were looking for in terms of limiting growth and sprawl. But what it didn't do is it didn't account for, didn't put in law sufficient amounts of affordable housing required to be built. Now, if you talk to Gary Patton, who wrote that, he will say that's not quite true, because Measure J required that a certain percentage of the new housing be built, that was going to be built in the affordable categories. But there was no consequence for not doing that. So I think going forward, the makeup that we have at this point of the better part of 40 years of managing our growth and protecting our environment is that we have some work to make up now, not by sacrificing our environment, not by overbuilding our community, but by taking those areas, and the area that has the most potential in our city for infill development, infill and refill development, is south of Laurel. That is where it's both politically possible to do it, and I think good growth strategies that pay attention to the building materials. Joy's absolutely right. What are the building materials that you're using? Where do you source those? What kind of concrete are you using? Because there are various kinds of concrete that have different impacts in terms of climate change. So the question becomes, could we, and I believe we could we as the residents of the city of Santa Cruz be as good about developing affordable, very low income, moderate income housing, together with job opportunities in the retail and commercial sectors, building a new neighborhood downtown that helps us and doing more than the minimum required by law in terms of affordability, that we can model how we can do that as well as we've managed our environment in Santa Cruz County for the last 40 years, because I don't think we should retreat from the concept that we need to be in control of our destiny, not the community that lives next door that is the most powerful economic engine in the world. I think that we have gotten to a place where thoughtful, careful, focused development, which I'm sure Joy has experienced this, I've experienced this, when you walk precincts, people are very concerned about SB 9 and 10 and SB 35, which are going to allow, which are state laws that preempt cities and counties from controlling their own destiny with regard to lots of development. We have to make a concerted affirmative effort to do the development we are going to have, to make sure that it is environmentally sustainable, making sure that it has sufficient amounts of very low and moderate income housing, so that what we're not doing is simply continuing to have a marketplace where virtually no one in the very low and low income categories can live in decent housing. So I think that there's an opportunity here for the city of Santa Cruz to model how it is you can engage in appropriate scale growth and development in a new neighborhood downtown that is reflective of the values that we in Santa Cruz have developed ever since the University of California came to town, which leads me to the last comment on this. It is imperative that the regents of the University of California build a hell of a lot more housing on campus. It is a major failure of the university. In our community, look, if it's UCLA and they build or don't build housing, it makes no difference in LA and the price of the product. But here, they're the 600-pound gorilla. They're the big player. We are smaller. And so it is imperative that in the long-range development plan negotiations with the regents and the office of the president, because the chancellor does not make this decision. The chancellor is an order taker when it comes to development on campus. The people that make the decisions on campus with regard to development are the regents of the University of California and the office of the president in Oakland. And we can leverage our political strength to get the right kind and volume of housing on campus, because our state senator is very likely to be the next president pro tem of the California Senate, which automatically makes him a regent of the University of California. So I think there are a lot of good things we can do in this regard. And I have great confidence that the smart people that live in this community, we can figure out how to do that. And I've laid out a plan how I think that can happen.
Thank you. Okay, Jane, I see that your hand is up. Do you have a follow-up question?
And I want to address this to both of you. Santa Cruz is a city manager city. And I'm wondering, I personally was opposed to having a citywide mayor because, but you guys may each have some answers for me. And I'm wondering, given where the sort of power and authority lies with the city manager, what role and what kinds of things do you think the mayor will be able to do? And I'm going to start with Fred and then Joy. I just keep wondering about this. It's one of the reasons I opposed having a mayor. I thought you'd spend a lot of time cutting ribbons or something.
Well, with regard to this, the change has been made. This was in settlement of a lawsuit, and the voters made this choice.
Yeah.
You could,
I'm sorry, Fred, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm interested in how you view this position, given where the responsibility and power lies in the city.
Well, you and I may have a disagreement on where the power lies. Councilmanic form of government means that the city manager is the executive in charge of the staff and the departments. The city council and the mayor are the ones that make the policy. They're the policy makers and the ordinance adopters and the lawmakers. And that has not changed. The directly elected mayor, what that has done is provided, whether you like it or don't like it, if you don't like it, that's fine too. But the new system that was the settlement of the lawsuit says we're going to have this directly elected mayor and 6 district council members. I think that the mayor, as the only remaining elected official citywide, is going to be obligated to look at issues citywide and work with their colleagues who have a more district orientation. Now, I'm familiar with that, having served both on the Board of Supervisors, which is districted, and in the state legislature, which is districted. And it's a lot of negotiations. It's a lot of conversation to balance all of that out. I think that my experience both on the Board of Supervisors and in the California State Legislature are well suited for working in this directly elected mayor and district city council members new environment that we're going to have. I'll make a prediction. I think that there's probably going to be a lawsuit over this. I'm not sure that this whole thing's finished simply because the city put a measure on the ballot.
Thank you. Joy?
Answering the question succinctly about what I think my role is would be as a mayor. I think the main role, the main power, since the job description doesn't change from before, seems to be setting the agenda, the calendar, and facilitating the meetings, setting the amount of public comment time and how many groups can get extra time. And I think that ability to set the agenda is actually really huge, because if you have a majority that, like we've had for the past few years, that changes the rules so that you can't even get something on the agenda unless you have 3 people putting it on, well, that skews the whole conversation. And I think one great thing, I mean, as mayor, you could, reverse that anyway, but one great thing about having districts, even though I disagreed with how this came to be, is that I think we'll have to change it back. Each district is going to have to be able to put something on the agenda, or else they're not going to have the representation that they're supposed to have. So I think really the power is, that's where it is. The agenda, the calendar, setting the tone, having the extra meetings with people, and really having those conversations that build consensus across difference, because that's going to be inevitable and super important to keep us from being just blocked all the time.
Thank you, Joy. Okay, Joy, since you're already on the screen, why don't you take a few minutes to give us your closing statement?
Okay.
If you have one.
I don't have a formal closing statement, so I'll just say that I really appreciate all of you sticking with this conversation. We've lost a few people along the way, but it's great to have these kinds of conversations, to meet new people and to see people that you know. And I appreciate the opportunity. And if anybody has any other questions for me or wants to talk about anything in particular, I had put some things in the chat, other issues that I feel strongly about, like police accountability.
Yes.
And public oversight of that. And and some other issues. So I'd love to talk to anybody anytime. I'll put my, oh, thank you, Amanda, for putting the website in there. And please, let's keep the conversation going. I'm enjoying it and I look forward to more.
Thank you so much.
Brenda, thank you. And the members of NAACP and others who have joined this evening, I appreciate the opportunity. It's always a pleasure to do this with Joy, who is so thoughtful about her approach to this campaign and articulating her positions on issues. She's a very thoughtful person, and I've enjoyed we got one more month of doing this together, and I'm looking forward to that as well. I wanted to hit on 3 real quick issues. Hopefully they're quick. That can resonate with NAACP. One of those is that environmental justice is a really important concept. And when I authored the 2 largest environmental protection bonds in California's history, we broke the mold, myself and Speaker Antonio Villaraigosa, to make sure that at least half of those bonds get spent in park-poor communities, largely in urban areas and communities of color. And I think that shows an awareness of the real needs, both in our community and in similar communities throughout California. When I left the legislature, the chancellor of the University of California at Santa Cruz named a lecture series on for me called the Fred Keeley Lectures on the Environment. And what I always tell people is the best news about that is that Keeley doesn't lecture. We get other people to come lecture. And so we've had Jane Lubchenco and we've had Bruce Babbitt, former Secretary of Interior. Jane Lubchenco was head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And after a few years of that annual lecture, I called up the chancellor and said, I don't feel right about this. You know, usually to get a lecture named after you at the University of California, you need to do one of 3 things, and I've done none of them. An act of scholarship, $1 million contribution to the university, or you die. And I hadn't done any of those things. So I said, I want to do something that the Keeley Lecture is associated with. So we developed a scholarship. And the way it works is that every year we give out about 4 of them, and I raised $650,000 that is in an account at the university for low-income students of color who are on campus and have summer projects, who otherwise need to go home to their community and raise money, take a summer job to work to bring money in for their family. And we said, what if you just tell us what that number is and we write you a scholarship check for that, and you stay on campus with your cohort and continue to work on this project that would otherwise you'd have to drop out of. And the other thing I want to mention, because I think that goes to the issue of justice. And Joy's been really good about talking about seeing issues through the lens of justice. And I think she's right about that. So the third thing I want to mention quickly is that for 150 years in California, the legislature did redistricting. And what that turns out to be is elected officials selecting their voters rather than voters selecting their elected officials. So when I was termed out of the legislature, I got together with a bunch of other folks statewide, and we did something called the Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission. And what we did is we changed the Constitution of the state of California. We took out of the hands of the legislature the every 10-year exercise of redrawing the congressional district lines, Senate district lines, and assembly district lines. We took it out of the hands of the legislature, where every one of them has a conflict of interest. And we put it in the hands of a Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission. You know what happened? What happened is that in the next 2 cycles of redistricting done by the Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission, the Latino caucus tripled The African American caucus doubled. The Pacific Islander caucus tripled. In other words, the legislature rapidly started looking like California rather than everybody looking like me. It made a dramatic difference in terms of representation and social justice and civil rights in the state of California. And I was proud and still am proud that that's how we do that. I will add one other feature, and that is, I think going forward, I suggested this to the city council, but couldn't get any takers. I think the same concept ought to apply to redistricting in the city of Santa Cruz. The next time the district lines are drawn, they shouldn't be done by the city in terms of the city council. They should not be the ones that draw those lines. It is impossible for them to draw the lines without being self-interested, not because they're bad people, but because that's the nature of it. You would do the same thing. So we need to take that out of their hands, I think, as well, and put it in the hands of a Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission for the city of Santa Cruz to make sure there's fair and equitable drawing of these district lines. And let me just close by saying, Brenda, it's always good to see you. It is good to see the other folks on this call, including Joy, who it is a joy to be in this campaign with her. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to be with all of you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. This has really been enlightening. And I'm very sure that our members have a different view, a different perspective of who you are and what you are going to do for this city, to both of you. So thank you so much. And hopefully this is just the beginning of a conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. And thank you to everyone who's hung in there with us tonight. Thank you.
Yeah.
Applause to you. And take care, and we will talk to you soon. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.